Well, our apologetics series, we are now on kind of nearing the end of it. The next couple of weeks, this week and at least next week and maybe the one after, we'll be looking at various world religions or philosophies that you're going to come in contact with, that you have come in contact with likely, to try to give you some helpful hints to understand people's perspectives. I often find that while it's not absolutely critical to understand or know everything about what a person, their religious views are, having a grounding of kind of where they're coming from is helpful. And more than that, too, understanding it properly is better than having a knee-jerk and kind of foolish response. I know that personally, I'm frustrated when people ascribe ideas and beliefs to me, because that's what Christians believe, or of any kind of stripe, when they are misrepresenting, misunderstanding things. It's frustrating because it doesn't paint me as who I am. And so, our best ability, when we have the opportunity, it's good to try to understand where people come from. And as we're going to look through religions here this morning, one thing is also important to note. What we understand as a religious system that's not Christianity, or any kind of religious ideas, what they ought to be or should be or logically are, doesn't mean that's what person A, who's a Buddhist, believes, or person B, who's a Muslim, believes. They can have all kinds of divergent beliefs and still call themselves those religions. Just take a look at Christianity. You can see any shape of belief and theological conclusion borne by someone who calls themselves a Christian. Now, whether or not they're actually a Christian is a different conversation, but they will identify as one, even if they have wildly unchristian beliefs. So even understanding religious systems, it doesn't always help in great amounts with individuals, because they may have a smorgasbord or a buffet style religious idea. And so while this is helpful, it only goes so far. And I think it's, again, helpful to at least have some ideas. And like I said, we'll get to some of these things on the handouts here. There is a I need to say from the outset too that the materials this morning I've compiled from a course seminar from Capitol Hill Baptist Church. I thought they formatted it really well, and it took most of the information and edited some of it, but this is pretty much the material from their curriculum, which I was greatly appreciative of. According to a 2007 survey of the entire world, if you lumped all professing Christians into one group and all the different Muslims groups into one group and Hindus into one group, and you had all these different groups, you would have these kinds of breakdowns for the world population. Christians would be 33% of the world population. Muslims would be 21%. Hindus, 13%. Buddhists at 5%, nearly 6%. Other groups and religions and kind of would be, various ones would be almost 12%, as well as the non-religious would also be 12% of the world's population. Atheists are about 2% at that time. Those who are defiantly or dogmatically anti-believers of religion. By contrast, in 2007, those who identify themselves as Jews, and that can get difficult with in a lot of places because it's both cultural and religious, but that's 0.2% of the world's population. So, and if you even break it down further, obviously Christians had a third of the world's population in that regard. those who would be Roman Catholic, and there's generally, I would say 100 or so different variations of Roman Catholicism that are there are schisms inside of the Roman Catholic Church that I think is appropriate to refer to as sub-denominations to an extent. They'd be about 17% of the overall world population. So over half of worldwide Christians would identify in some degree as being Roman Catholic. Protestants would have been just under 5 or just about 5.75%. So, and that's everyone who's not basically Roman Catholic, who's not Orthodox, meaning Eastern Orthodox, or Anglican, which would be the Church of the United Kingdom. And the Orthodox would be, again, which is the Eastern kind of half of the Holy Roman Empire. Think about the Orthodox churches of Russia, of Ukraine, and other kinds of Eastern states. That's 3.5%. So you have a large divergence even inside of the Christians inside of in the world here. But it's just helpful, I think, to look at the various breakdowns that while there are numerically superior Christians in the world, when it comes to, again, even inside of those places that where a true gospel message finds home and approval, you're looking at less than 6% of the entire world's population. That doesn't mean that there's not a believing, that's not fair, 6%, because Anglicanism is not terrible in itself. So I should say that's about maybe 7%. Anglicanism isn't by its very creeds antithetical to the gospel. There's a lot that's formed that way. But Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy definitionally do not affirm the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, again, we have a rather small footprint on the world in that regard. So it's important to understand, how diverse those who claim to be Christian are as we start to think about world religions, because Christianity is not unique in that there are, particularly Protestantism, divisions between Lutherans and Presbyterians and Baptists and non-denominationalists and all kinds of things. Those kinds of divisions in different forms are present in most religious systems. Now, some of the questions that are going to be important when you talk about obviously the gospel with unbelievers who have different religious affiliations, you're going to have people who are going to say, well, don't all religions essentially teach the same thing? Isn't every religion trying to tell you how to be good and moral and sincere and nice and those kinds of things? And which is a postmodern reductionistic misunderstanding of religions. But that's one of the common things you'll hear. And you'll even hear when you talk to unbelievers or even some who claim to be Christians, well, is Jesus truly the only way? Well, and we believe that he is, and we'll get to that hopefully this morning. And the question about what about people who've never heard the gospel? How does if there's at this point in time, over 2/3 of the world is not even Christian in a broad category sense, and I didn't look up the numbers of the unreached peoples in the world still. How do we understand those things? Those are all reasonable questions that with time, we'll get to this morning. But it's important to understand, I think, again, have an idea of what other religions stand for in general, knowing that individuals in those religions are going to have various levels of adherence to those beliefs. So a couple of things here. Let's look at first categories of religion. I got them listed there. Monotheism, polytheism, henotheism, and pantheism. And we'll look at those, and they're important ideas. Theism obviously is the word for God, and so we'll talk about what these mean. Monotheism teaches that there is only one God, and there are only 3 religions in the world that, at least primary religions that are really well known, that are monotheistic: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Now, Islam and Judaism may have a theological concerned that, well, Christianity, I mean, they claim to be monotheistic, but they believe in three persons, so they would see potentially our affirmation of monotheism as, with an asterisk. Well, I mean, so, but in all, trying to be as generous as we can when it comes to other religions too, there's only three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We differ, obviously, as relates to so many things, but that is the thing that combine, or that I suppose not unites, but that is really similar. And actually, this is one of the most important similarities in religions. When we're talking about differences in religions, we'll talk about it in a moment. But one of my favorite apologists cut his teeth reaching out to and evangelizing Mormons. And his conclusion, and I think he's right on this, is that Islam is far closer to Christianity than Mormonism is, for the primary reason that Mormonism is, some will say polytheistic, but I've got it under henotheism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, they're not monotheists in what they believe, ultimately. So there's that. Second, we have polytheism. Polytheism is, again, there are many gods. If you think about the pantheon of gods in the old, in the ancient world, and even nowadays in Hinduism, you have all numbers of gods. The Jupiter, you have Mars, you have all kinds of, again, Roman and Greek gods, or you have all the different kinds of gods of the ancient world, which, again, there's often a crossover between pantheism and henotheism. Pantheism is there are many gods and you worship them all, essentially. Henotheism is there are many gods, but you have adherence to one primary god out of the many gods. And so you wouldn't necessarily classify some of the ancient religions that worship Baal and Ashtoreth, but really went after their primary god was Baal. You wouldn't say they were henotheists necessarily. The best example of henotheism that I can think of is, again, Mormonism. Mormonism, as a theological system, believes that there is essentially an infinite number of gods, because in infinite regress, essentially, if you go back in history, a god populated a planet with spirit babies, that some of them grew up to be their own gods of their own universes who had spirit babies, and then some of them grew up to be gods, and it was just this continuing explosion of multiple gods. And in Mormonism, they speak of God in the same language we do the Bible, but their understanding of God the Father, that he is one of many spirit offspring of his own spirit parentage. And so it's a weird, again, non-Christian religion, but in their religion, they believe in the primacy of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Again, their non-biblical picture of those things. So they'd be the best picture that I can think of henotheism. They believe the existence of many gods, but worship one primary among them. Pantheism is the fourth category. Pantheism is all is God, or God is in all. And this is, you see this all over different places, even in philosophy. But the idea is that, again, God is not just everywhere, but he is in everything and is everything. And so pantheists would say that we are God, God is in us, God is in the pulpit, God is in the chair, and those kinds of things. So these are just general categories of religious systems. Any questions on those religious kind of systems or categories before we move on to the next stuff? That's the highest part of, it's the, and I forget the way that what it's classically called, but this kind of statement is, as man is, God once was; as God is, man can become. They believe that they can be exalted to, if they achieve the highest whatever level of exaltation, they can be granted the privilege of being a god at, populating a new world of spirit children. It's a very it's a very sexually focused religious eternal system. Essentially, religion, eternity for the Mormon in their minds is forever making and having children. That's really what it is. So, but yeah, there's this idea they can be hopefully become gods in the future. Yeah, and this is why I'm so strong. I have a very strong aversion to the idea that, well, if you are a fundamentally non-Christian and non-monotheistic system, there's a movement in our day and age to kind of mute over the differences and talk about Mormonism as part of the broader umbrella of Christian religion. And it fundamentally is not and cannot be seen as that, theologically speaking. It is so much more foreign to biblical truth, biblical doctrine, the biblical gospel than even Islam is, because Islam, for all of its wrongs, is monotheistic. So it's an important distinction there. Any other questions? Let's look at a couple specific religious systems here. And I've just tried to summarize some of the key tenets of the different religions here that will hopefully are helpful here for us. Islam means submission to God, and Muslims is the name of the followers of Islam. Again, I'm quoting here from the information. There's a lot more about the different religions you can get many different places. This is by no means meant to be an exhaustive summary, but hopefully a good kind of basic understanding if you're not familiar with these. Islam is more than just a simple belief system. It's a way of life, a social and legal system that governs all of life. It would be, again, similar to talking about Islam as it is talking about like the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant in the life of Jews. It was all encompassing, not just a religious life, but legal life, all kinds of areas. That's probably a good, a reasonable comparison there to think about those things. It involves things like cleanliness, dress, all kinds of other observances. Currently, for sure, over 1 billion Muslims globally, and largely in the Middle East, Indonesia, India, and elsewhere. The beginning of Islam is around 622 AD by Muhammad, who believed he was the final messenger, whom Allah revealed the faith to the world. He believes that he was the last in a long line of prophets. There's several things we can talk about Muhammad's life and his religious experience and things, but ultimately Islam began with him 600 years or so after the time of Christ. And I'll just say as an aside, Islam speaks of the Quran speaks of Christianity, and if you look at how they refer to Christianity, it betrays the author's misunderstanding of what Christianity was, even as clarified even in the 600s. In other words, one of the arguments for against the inspiration, the divine inspiration of the Quran, is that the Quran misrepresents, misunderstands Christianity of that time, which would be a thing that God wouldn't do. So that's just a helpful little tidbit there. By 632, so 10 years later, Muhammad and his followers had taken control of Mecca and most of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's kind of where the proselytizing and the spread of Islam began. They believe that they refer to God as Allah. Allah is a word for God that is true. That's just a name for, or a word that means God. They believe they would not believe in the incarnation of God. They believe that is blasphemous and out of hand. They believe that God is all powerful. He's merciful in his own regard, but again, their idea of mercy is not what I would regard as mercy. He's judge, but there is no mediator. Salvation, if you want to talk about salvation, again, a word that is not necessarily they would use. It is works based. In other words, pleasing Allah is the way to not be judged by him. And I've listed below on your outlines there what they call the 5 pillars, the 5 primary things that Muslims are to believe and do so as to avoid the wrath of God. They believe, I believe it's called, I think it's I'm not going to try it. The basic affirmation, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is the creedal statement that must be said for all Muslims to be Muslims. They pray 5 times a day in a very, and I think obviously in the cities, if you're around up there, you'll hear the calls to prayer or at different places over loudspeakers. That's because this is the religious requirement for Muslims. Fasting during the 9th month of Ramadan, which is essentially, I believe it's fasting during the day, and then they party at night. And now however that was supposed to be or whatever else, but they fast during the daylight hours of Ramadan. They give almsgiving to the poor is a requirement for their religious system. 2.5% of savings. I believe that's the right number. Don't quote me on that. That could be wrong. And then finally, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in your life. You must do that. And again, I've heard of different systems say, well, those who are prohibited can do a spiritual, pilgrimage, whatever else. But these are the general things created by, the founders of this religion when they lived near the place where Mecca was. And so, this is just their religious system. Converting to Islam requires specific external actions, specifically the confession that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, and to submit to the teachings of Islam. Now, there are 2 different, this is also helpful just philosophically from the position of Islam. There are 2 different worlds when it comes to the world, the globe. There is the world of Islam and the world of war. In other words, there's this place of under Islam that is where it's supposed to be. Everything else is the world that is to be at war with, to convert to Islam. The Muslims do not believe that the Bible is the sole word of God. That there is affirmation of the Torah and the Injil, that they are from God, but they believe that the Quran is the primary book. Again, there's all kinds of apologetic conversations that can be had around that. But they would have a reverence for the Bible, believe the Bible's corrupted, essentially. That's kind of the gist of what they believe. Muslims believe that essentially Abraham was a Muslim, that the Bible gets it wrong. Essentially, that even that instead of Isaac being blessed, it was Ishmael's. They have a whole different picture on there. They don't believe that Jesus died on the cross. They believe that he. Here's a quote from the Quran. It says, "They killed him not, they crucified him not, but it was likened unto him. They killed him not knowingly, but God raised him, and God is the most merciful of merciful." In other words, God was so merciful that he could never allow a prophet such as Jesus to be crucified. So somehow it appeared to them that way, but he wasn't really crucified. So they deny the crucifixion. They deny the Trinity, and I think they have a misunderstanding of the Trinity in their scriptures as well. So they have a wrong understanding of the Christian faith and of the gospel. And really, one of the things that ought to be, as this is common with a lot of religions, the question of evangelistically, how do you know you're good enough to avoid the judgment of God? And what about grace, essentially? Because ultimately they're going to find themselves unsure of, either pridefully confident or burdened with the knowledge that they're not good enough, unless we can bring in God's grace. So that's just, again, a flyover of Mormonism, Islam. Secondly, Hinduism, pantheistic religion. Again, about 1 billion Hindus. Hinduism is probably as old as, if you think about the time of Moses, actually probably the time of Abraham, it's probably that old as far as in other parts of the world. Hinduism does not offer the same insistence on being the only truth. So there is no dominant or correct form of Hinduism. I think I have it in your outlines there. Hinduism is not a set of static beliefs, but it continually develops. It explains history in a circular, nonlinear fashion. So talk about like this circle of time would be Hinduism. Hindu practice is a belief that all souls are eternal and accountable for their own actions. Karma is the judgment reality. Again, karma is an impersonal force outside of any personal being that somehow holds people accountable. There is no single idea in Hinduism of God. There is the absolute, called the Brahman, I believe. The impersonal, all-embracing spirit. You could say there is one God among many gods, even with them. It's not a Western oriented system of believing. Every Hindu in general wants to escape from the cycle of life and death and rebirth. Again, the judgment that karma brings, they want to avoid that. Again, the ultimate aim is to escape from the cycle and be liberated. So they're not going to be continually reincarnated. So, I mean, they have a very, again, foreign, obviously, view of religion and God, from what we would obviously understand to be true. There are, again, and one of the biggest things is their understanding of judgment is impersonal. There is no personal judgment, and so it's important to talk about the requirement of a personal God who's been offended, and the person of Jesus. They believe, most Hindus probably believe, that Jesus is a divine manifestation, divine being, but to exalt Jesus as the singular incarnation of God would be the place to go there, and to really hold up what he said compared to what they believe about all the things. Next, we have Buddhism. 500 million Buddhists worldwide in China, Tibet, and East Asia. This I thought was helpful. As I was reading through this statement I have in your outlines, it is difficult to talk sensibly about Buddhism because Buddhists are dogmatic that one cannot be linguistically dogmatic about anything. So, there you go. What does that mean? Exactly. What does it mean? What do you think it means? You can't be linguistically dogmatic about anything in Buddhism. In other words, the idea of trying to pin down to objective statements, they would reject that whole concept and idea. And actually, in some ways, I see this bleeding over even into like Eastern Orthodox thought. Not that they're pantheistic or polytheistic, but there's this kind of idea that we can't be dogmatic and clear and write down explicitly what God has said and what he means, because it's too much, it's too high for us. So they would say that, again, speaking about Buddhists, you cannot be dogmatic about anything, including what all the things in Buddhism means. It's a lot more of a feelings-based or kind of fluctuating idea. Feelings-based is maybe not the right way to put it. Over the last 30 years, again, this is a quote from the material here, Buddhism has seen growth in the West as its non-dogmatic nature, its not rationality, and the possibility of spiritual guidance or finding spirit guides and other kinds of things have made it attractive to a postmodern society. In other words, a society that doesn't have fixed ideas of truth, this is appealing to, which is what the West has become of late. Buddhism teaches that we are all God, and that God is in us, in all people. There's no omnipotent creator God who exists apart from the universe. Buddhists also believe in karma. Buddhism teaches that the illusions which bring human beings comfort and delude themselves includes the illusions of material inconsistency and reliability. In other words, they believe that there's most things are illusions that you can essentially see through. There are four noble truths of Buddhism. One is to live is to suffer. Suffering then is also caused by desire. In other words, we allow ourselves to get caught up in material things. They would say that one can eliminate suffering by elimination of desire, in order to accept things as they are and not to desire to have possessions. And desire is eliminated by following the eightfold path, which I'm not going to go into that, but that brings you to nirvana. So it is a very different worldview. Again, they would also say that Jesus was a teacher, an enlightened teacher, maybe even another Buddha in their minds. Again, but they would they get the understanding of man, of God, all wrong, because they're not monotheists. They don't understand sin. They have a lot of problems there. So ultimately, one of the things that even just briefly looking at these three non-Christian religions and having an understanding of Christianity, when people ask, don't all religions teach the same thing? Well, the answer is no, we don't. They have different... Each of the religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, have different understandings of man, of God, of the world, of reality, of what is the goal, what is the reason for suffering or for hardship. One says it's illusion, others says it's obviously the consequence of sin. So there's all kinds of differences there, and so they're not all teaching the same thing. There's significant differences, again, even from a broad global scale of thinking about the religions. When it comes to, is Jesus the only way? Obviously he is the only way, and the question, when we talk about that with others, some might say that's arrogant, some might say that is foolishness or whatever it might be. And ultimately, other men and other religions are free to make those kinds of value judgments. But ultimately, if Jesus is the only way, which he is, then men need to hear and believe. And the truths of the scriptures will not be, will find a residing place in the ears of those who will believe, whether they come from the Western world, the Eastern world, or other kinds of religions. Question about, what about people who've never heard the good news of Jesus? This is a very common question that comes up when you talk about evangelism, or you talk about any kind of ultimate conversation about the gospel. Now, a couple of things, we'll talk about that specific question, right? But if someone is talking to you and they ask the question, what about those who've never heard the gospel? Well, the first thing to remember and even talk about is, that's a fine conversation, but you know that doesn't relate to you. The person you're talking to doesn't fall into that category. So it's a fine and good conversation to have, but ultimately, the person you're talking to, they don't fall into that category, whatever that category is. And so that's an important thing to start off, and oftentimes it'll come back to, whether it's a hypothetical person on a desert island somewhere, or a great grandparent, or whatever else, whatever, those kinds of things, those are the kinds of thoughts usually in the minds. But ultimately, the person you're talking to, that person doesn't fall under the category of having never heard, unless you've never shared the gospel with them, and then in that case, you get to share the gospel with them. But ultimately, that's the first, I think, apologetics point there. But when it comes to those who've never heard the gospel, what is the Christian biblical answer to what happens to those? How does God deal with those who live and die never having heard the gospel of Jesus Christ? Any thoughts? Before we answer that question, has anyone ever been asked that question or had that question asked to them? Anybody? A couple of us? Okay. 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 Any thoughts? Noah? Start over. What'd you say? You said God is a what? God has a place in man's heart. God has the love for him and who exists inside of man's heart. There's no excuse to say, I didn't know he existed. When we told him about him, it was placed in man's heart, so there's no excuse. Okay. Romans 1:20. But since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have clearly been seen and being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Okay. Stephanie?
And ultimately, a person is not sent to hell because they have never heard about Jesus, but because they are dead in their sin and deserving of punishment.
Yeah, these are all of your thoughts and scripture is right. That ultimately the issue is the reason. What happens to men or people who don't hear the gospel? Number one, they have sinned before God, whether or not they hear the gospel. Number two, as Julie read, all men are without excuse because there's enough known about God in creation and in conscience to know that we're sinning against him, to be held accountable for that sin. All the universe testifies. God has set eternity in men's hearts. That there is this innate, not knowledge of God in a personal way, but we know that he exists. And we know against whom we've sinned. There is no excuse. So the biblical answer to what happens to those who've never heard is that those who never heard stand before the Lord and are judged for what they have done. And they have no righteousness to commend themselves to God. They will be found guilty as all others will. The ultimate answer is that, again, as Stephanie said, people are not condemned for having rejected Jesus. Rejecting Jesus is a sin for which people are condemned. That is true. But it is not the sin, not the reason that men and women are condemned. Any sin and all sin is that which God is just and right to condemn sinners for in the end. So ultimately, when it comes to that question, people will respond to that in a sense of, well, that's not fair. Well, ultimately, that is exactly fair. I should look for this. I was talking to Micah a couple weeks ago, and I made a comment. The first sermon I ever preached way back in the day, and I titled it, I called it the unfair gospel. Because the gospel is not about fair to us. We don't want fairness. We want grace. If God gives me what I deserve is fair to me for what I have done, then I am in real trouble. God treating everyone fair according to what they have done is a recipe for condemnation for men. It's by God's grace, by his mercy, that men are saved. And again, the issue is, when we're talking to the person who brings that objection, that concern, is you've heard, and if you call to Christ, if you repent and believe, you will be saved. That is the good news of the gospel. So there's all manner of good news in the fact that there is a vast majority of the world is in religious opposition to God and his gospel doesn't mute or minimize the grace of the gospel or the power of the gospel. It just means that when we have opportunities to share the gospel, we have a lot of different confused and deceived people who have different beliefs that need to hear the truth, because on their own they stand condemned by holy God. Well, again, I hope this was a helpful little quick 500-foot overview of some religions and some ideas here. Let me close this in prayer. If you have any other questions, please talk to me afterwards. Father, thank you so much for today and for this time we could think about some important issues related to the gospel and to evangelism and to sharing our hope with those who question us and even have questions for us. Bless us now, Lord, as we have a time of fellowship. May you be honored in Christ's name. Amen.